Hi, my name is Grant Scarp, and my presentation's on fitness and injuries military training, specifically basic training or initial recruit training within the military, which is something I have a little bit of information or a little bit of knowledge about. So please pay attention during this presentation, as there will be a short test at the end of this presentation. So fitness, physical training, and military training are all very important parts of life in the military. Unfortunately, injuries in both physical training and normal military training do happen from time to time. In this presentation, we'll explore the relationship between physical fitness and injuries in military training. Again, this is more specific around basic training. So a little bit of background on what we normally do for our training in the military. So physical training, or PT, is usually 1 hour or more a day. On basic training, things like that, a lot of things you do is really physical, so I'd almost argue that it's a little bit more than just an hour a day, but they usually have an hour of dedicated PT per day. On courses like basic training, that can be up to 7 days a week. Military training is often inherently physical in nature, as you can imagine. Carrying heavy loads over long distances, such as ruck marching, doing things like section attacks, are also extremely physically demanding. It's a lot of sprinting and stuff, and even just doing normal maintenance on military vehicles. Military vehicles aren't light, so everything about them is pretty heavy because they're armored. Physical fitness testing is also based off the Cooper's test, especially for these studies that I'm I base my information off of. The U.S. Army primarily uses the Cooper's test as their physical fitness standard. Canada also uses it a lot, so that's where most of this comes from. So about the Cooper's test. The Cooper's test is a 1.5 mile timed run. It's an all-out effort. You go as fast as you possibly can. Maximum push-ups. You also do your maximum amount of sit-ups in 1 minute, and then your maximum pull-ups. Some testing, I know in Canada we use also your maximum one rep max on bench press as well. Some places use bench press, some don't. It's not 100% consistent on that. In Canada we do though. So studies have also shown that about 50% of personnel will injure themselves annually per year. I can actually attest to that. Many of these injuries will arise from physical training. Some also arise from normal training. Interestingly, it was even found actually that overseas that most of the injuries, most of the air medical evacuations were actually not from combat-related injuries, but from PT-related injuries. Fortunately, the military, both Canadian and American, and almost every military actually, really likes to do studies about things. Some of them are on how and why soldiers get injured, and like injured during training specifically, and they do this in order to better understand how and why this happens, and hopefully prevent it in the future. So the major risk factors, it's really the meat and potatoes about this presentation are your cardiorespiratory endurance, muscular endurance and strength, flexibility, body composition, and health behaviors. So cardiorespiratory endurance, as measured by run times or VO2 max. It's the most consistent and biggest factor associated with risk of injury during training. We've found that the less aerobically fit you are, or the slower you can run the 1.5 mile run, the more likely you are to suffer an injury. In fact, up to 3 times more likely. Next, the muscular endurance. That's measured by your push-ups. The lower level of muscular endurance you have was also found to be the next most commonly identified risk factor for injuries. In a separate case study, which I'll get into a little bit later, the FBI didn't find it as reliable as a risk factor as the Army did. The Army did found that you're up to 1.6 times more likely to suffer an injury based on this factor, though. Flexibility. The association of flexibility and risk of injury in the military hasn't really been very well studied. But interestingly, the Army did find that recruits that were most flexible and least flexible compared to like the average flexibility were at a higher risk to become injured. Body composition. So your BMI and risk of injuries has been super consistent in military studies. Some have shown that it's not a factor at all. Others have shown that it's much more of a factor. Interestingly, it was found that in one study at least that if you were super lean and had a slow run time, or super heavy and had a slow run time, you're at much higher risk. Actually, as a super lean person than you were as the heavier person for those run times. So I thought that was actually really interesting that it still goes back to your aerobic capacity or your run times as the number one factor there. Also health behaviors. So it found that recruits that had a sedentary lifestyle before enlisting that like didn't work out very often were up to 2.5 times more likely to suffer an injury than those that actually exercise regularly. It's not really a huge surprise there. Obviously, the more fit you are, the more your body's able to handle the stresses of things like basic training. Also, tobacco use. Amazingly, tobacco use is actually really bad for you. I think we all know that by now. Smoking wasn't a huge surprise that you're up to about 2.8 times more likely to suffer an injury as a smoker versus a non-smoker. Surprisingly, though, because it's actually really prevalent in military culture right now to use chewing tobacco or snuff or dip, depending on where you are. It depends on what they call it. You're actually up to 4.4 times more likely to suffer an injury as a chewing tobacco user versus a non-tobacco user. I found that really interesting because I quit smoking in June. So, it's a separate study of FBI recruits, recruit training rather. The FBI noted several differences in some statistics of injuries versus the statistics from U.S. Army studies. This is possibly due to much smaller focus group, as the FBI recruits a lot and trains a lot less people annually than the Army does, obviously. Also, difference in training approach styles. The FBI focuses a lot more on suspect takedown and kind of like hand-to-hand self-defense or combat. And the Army focuses a lot more on carrying a heavy load over a distance and then conducting its business from there. Both U.S. Army and the FBI also found that aerobic fitness directly contributed to the lower injury rate. So again, that 1.5 mile run, the faster you did that, the much lower risk you were for injury during training. The U.S. Air Force has conducted a study of the Fit to Fight program, they called it, in 2004, which was to study the injuries on versus their PT test and their fitness levels. Wasn't for new recruits. This was for existing already trained personnel that had gone to their respective units on a base. And the program is considered a more accurate way of measuring the members' VO2 max and aerobic capacity. The study concluded that the program has increased overall fitness of the soldiers, but also increased the amount of injuries related to PT, and they couldn't directly relate that you were more fit versus before and the injury rates. So it was decided that you definitely need to work more on injury prevention, though, if you're going to increase average soldiers' fitness levels. So inclusion is an absolute requirement to be physically fit in the military, especially when conducting military training such as basic training. It's a very intensive program. So it's also important to know that increasing fitness levels will also increase risk for injuries. It's just as important to increase injury prevention techniques as it is to increase fitness or training volume. So on to the test now, as I promised. Question 1, what does the Cooper's test consist of? Question 2, what percentage of military personnel will sustain an injury each year? question 3, what is the #1 risk factor to suffering an injury in training? Please post your answers to the comments. I look forward to hearing from you. And here are my references as well. Thank you very much.